distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to join you here for the launch of the District Vulnerability Index for Pakistan. When I got this invitation, I was pretty prompt in terms of saying I would want to be there. For a very simple reason, that as Minister of Finance, I'm always asked about the IMF program, about the structural reforms, about how quickly are we going to turn around post the macroeconomic stability and the various indices around that. I've been equally consistent that while, inshallah, we are on a good trajectory from stabilization, inshallah, going on to growth, but we will not be able to realize the potential of Pakistan if we don't deal with two existential issues that Dr. Zeba Sathar also mentioned, which is population and climate change. On the population side, while we can talk about the high-level number, which is obviously not sustainable in any country at 2.55%, whichever GDP growth number you take, if you have that kind of growth, it's not sustainable. But it's really the underlying issues, and that's where the report also goes more granular, whether it's child stunting, where 40% of our children under the age under a certain age are stunted. And that's the future leadership of Pakistan. The second one is around learning poverty, and it's essentially girls out of school. That's 50% of our productive workforce in Pakistan. And both of us are these things are very, very serious matters. Coming to climate change, I'm sure the Minister is going to go into much more detail with respect to how he is leading the charge since the time he has assumed office. But decarbonization, I just got back from Lahore last night. We know how the indices are being tracked, but the reality is, again, that is not sustainable. And the climate resiliency bit, where everyone talks about that we have to move on to the adaptation path. It's less about emission, it's more about adaptation. Now, both of these are critical. And therefore, from my perspective and from my ministry's perspective, we see ourselves providing assistance, support, any way we can to the Minister of Climate Change and Minister of Health. That's our role. That's our role. Because, when I went to Washington, as soon as I assumed the role for the IMF World Bank spring meetings, for the first time I joined the meeting of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Change. And for a little while I wondered why I'm there. But I was very quick to figure out, and then over the last 18 months, I'm convinced that if the finance ministers don't play their role in taking these things mainstream, making them part of budgets, making them part of resource allocation, this is not going to go where we think and where we need this to go. Dr. Zeba Sathar, your report that you just mentioned, it's commendable that it's 3 years of research and therefore data-driven. And therefore, in the 6 domains, what you have given us is actionable MIS. Because it's MIS, and then what do you do with that MIS? And therefore, the kind of granularity that's been provided is, I think, very, very important. That's one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it is highlighting the interlinkages, the multiplier factor from what I have read in terms of how these two aspects reinforce each other. Actually, in Pakistan's case, negatively, whether it's the population momentum or where we are in terms of climate change. Now, some of the aspects that you have brought out in terms of providing insights into the geographical divide, the vulnerable districts, which are overwhelmingly concentrated in Balochistan, followed by Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and therefore the critical overlap that the populations which are already struggling in terms of whether it's poverty, infrastructure, limited services, what I would call social vulnerabilities, are the ones which end up being exposed mostly to climate shocks through drought, extreme temperature rises, or floods. I recall when Dr. Musaddiq was one of the first ones to reach Khyber Pakhtunkhwa when those floods came in, and I'm sure he will go into a lot of detail what he found there. He has been very vocal in terms of, the people, the haves and the have-nots, and what happened in terms of the discussions which need to be carried on. He's leading the 300-day plan, which has been asked by the Prime Minister, so that this does not recur as we go forward. But again, this has there are various empirical studies. I mean, while we talk about that Pakistan is not a big emission creator, but the reality is empirical studies show that a certain percentage decrease in population does lead to a certain decrease in emissions in Pakistan. And therefore there is a certain level of correlation from that perspective as well. Now, one aspect which I do want to bring it to your attention, to the Population Council, where I would like to request if there can be further research done there, that over a period of time we have seen rural migrants who have been moving to the urban and peri-urban centers seeking opportunity, and rightly so. What they do end up, and what we have seen, is them being in informal settlements, or what we call kachi abadis. And that's where these kachi abadis, we have seen inadequate water, sanitation, hygiene infrastructure, which in turn leads to poor nourishment, and in turn brings the whole child stunting discussion back into the equation. And as you know, child stunting is we've done interventions on the nutritional side, but the reality is it's the entire spectrum, from water sanitation to hygiene to the gap which is required between childbirths. And that's where I find this population and climate and everything come together. So I would like to request that in terms of the urban vulnerable, if I can call it that, if the Population Council can also give a little bit of time and attention to that. So the two takeaways from my perspective: one, recognizing the interdependence of the two challenges. One feeds the other, population and climate change. And the other is around equity and resource reform and resource allocation, where, as we go forward, to incorporate the backwardness and vulnerability as defined by DVIP into the resource allocation framework as we move forward. With that, I would like to again thank the organizers. Thank you, Dr. Zeba Sattar, for for leading the charge, for getting this report through the finishing line and providing us, once again, actionable MIS. And in that journey, you had mentioned FCDO. So I do want to acknowledge, because FCDO and the UK government has been helping us in many ways around our revenue mobilization, around overall the remit program, but your role and support and assistance here is highly valued. So once again, my deep appreciation to the UK government, to the High Commissioner, who has helped us in many ways. I wish you all the very best for the rest of the conference. I know you have a panel discussion as well, and I look forward to hearing back in terms of any further recommendations which might come through that panel. Thank you again, and all the very best. Yeah.